He hadn't meant to buy a ranch, not really, but the deal came at him like so many things in life. Unexpected, crooked at the edges, and just cheap enough to make a man's instincts whisper that it couldn't possibly be right. And when the gavel struck in that hot, cramped courthouse, and the auctioneer barked, "Sold, for $22 to Mr. Caleb Turner," the laughter of the crowd echoed with a cruel edge, as though they all knew something he didn't. But Caleb had spent years riding fence lines and driving cattle for other men, saving pennies where he could, and when the chance to own something of his own came, even for the price of a saddle and a week's grub, he couldn't let it slip. So he tipped his hat, handed over the money, and walked out with a deed in his pocket and a strange hollowness in his chest. Because if land that once cost blood and sweat and family name could be sold for less than a bottle of whiskey, then either God himself had smiled on him or the devil was laughing in his ear. And as the sun burned down on him, Caleb mounted his horse and rode the miles out to the edge of the valley where the ranch sat, watching the fields roll by, grass dry and brittle under the relentless sky, until at last he saw it, the outline of a weather-beaten house leaning against the wind, a barn slouched low like it was tired of standing, fences broken in places where no cattle had passed in years, and a silence hanging over it all so thick he almost reined back. But pride pressed him forward, and he rode up slow, boots thudding against the dirt as he dismounted, eyes scanning the place with a cautious wonder, because though it was falling apart, it was his, and that word alone, his, felt like a miracle after years of being nothing more than hired hands on other men's dreams. But as he pushed open the sagging door and stepped into the gloom of the house, the air hit him, stale, sour, tinged with something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand. And he stopped dead, blinking against the dim light filtering through broken shutters, because there, in the center of the room, from a beam blackened by smoke and years, hung a shape that turned his stomach to stone, a figure, slight and still, swaying just enough in the draft that whistled through the gaps, her hair black as raven's wing, spilling like a curtain over her shoulders, her skin the color of sun and earth, her feet bare and cold above the dusty boards, and for a heartbeat Caleb thought she was dead, that his ranch had come with a corpse nailed into its bones. But then her chest shuddered, a thin rasp of breath breaking the silence, and her fingers twitched against the rope that bound her wrists, and the shock of it drove him forward, fumbling with his knife, cutting her down so fast they both crashed to the floor in a heap, and she gasped like a fish dragged from water, eyes flying open wide and wild, dark pools brimming with terror and defiance, and Caleb knelt there, staring into the face of an Apache girl no more than 17 or 18, her skin marred by bruises and cuts, her lips cracked, her wrists raw where the rope had bitten, and before he could speak, she shoved at him with what little strength she had, whispering words broken but fierce. "They left me here, for you," and the chill that rolled through him was colder than any winter wind, because suddenly the laughter in that courthouse made sense. The cheapness of the land, the eyes that had followed him as though watching a man walk into his own grave, and Caleb realized this ranch was no blessing. It was a snare, and he was already caught in it. Caleb Turner sat there in the dust of his new ranch house, his chest heaving from the shock of what he had just cut down, the Apache girl lying at his feet like some wounded hawk, her breath ragged, her eyes sharp as obsidian even in her weakness, and as he tried to steady her shoulders she spat out words half in English, half in her own tongue, words he didn't know but felt all the same, fear, warning, fire, until she clawed at the floorboards as if she meant to dig her way out, and when he caught her wrists gently to stop her, she flinched as though his touch was another chain, another cruelty. And Caleb's gut twisted, for he had spent his life working hard under other men, never striking a woman, never taking advantage of the weak, but he knew how the world turned, how men in dusty saloons spoke of deals, made with whiskey and coin, and he began to piece it together. The ranch auctioned for pennies, the laughter in the courthouse, the girl strung up inside as if she were part of the bargain, and a fury built inside him, not just at the cruelty done to her but at the way he'd been made into a player in some vile joke. So he rose to his feet and looked around the broken house, every shadow now a threat, every creak of timber sounding like a whisper of the men who had set him up. And he knew if he was to keep this land, if he was to keep this girl alive, he'd have to dig his heels in and fight, because out here in the heartland there were no sheriffs worth a damn, no courts that cared, only the hard edge of a rifle and the will to stand. And when he looked down again, the girl was staring at him, her lips trembling as she forced words through the rawness of her throat. "Why, you helped me." And Caleb swallowed hard, his voice low, rough with dust and anger. "Because I don't leave people to die." But even as he said it, he heard hoofbeats in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder, rolling down the valley like thunder, and the girl's eyes widened with dread, her body curling tighter against the boards, whispering one word that chilled him through the bone. Hunters, and Caleb knew the $22 he had spent was no bargain. It was blood money, and the men riding in were coming to collect far more than coin. The night came heavy over the ranch, clouds swallowing the stars until the world seemed smaller, pressed in by the dark, and Caleb sat with his back against the doorframe of the sagging house, rifle balanced across his knees, every muscle wound tight while the girl lay wrapped in an old horse blanket a few feet away, her breaths shallow but steady now, her eyes open and glinting whenever the faint light from the dying fire caught them. And though she had spoken little since he'd cut her down, Caleb could feel the weight of her gaze like a question he wasn't ready to answer. Because he hadn't chosen this, hadn't chosen her. Yet now they were bound together by something harsher than choice. The cruel joke of desperate men in the land they called lawless. And as the silence stretched, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote and the restless stamping of his horse in the corral, Caleb's thoughts circled back to the hoofbeats from earlier, the hunters she'd whispered of, and he knew they hadn't gone far. Men like that never did. They circled like wolves, waiting for the right moment, and sure enough, before the moon even had a chance to break through the clouds, he caught sight of a flicker of lantern light moving across the ridge, slow and deliberate, and his gut nodded, for it meant they weren't just passing through, they were watching, measuring him, daring him to hold onto what they'd left hanging as bait. And Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle stock, his mind replaying every fight he'd ever been in, every time he'd stood toe-to-toe with men meaner than sin. And though he was outnumbered now, though the ground seemed to tilt against him, he felt a fire stir inside, because no man had ever owned him, and he wasn't about to start being owned now, not by crooked deals nor the devils who made them. And when he glanced at the girl again, her lips moved faintly, forming words he could barely catch. "They come, they take me back, kill you." And something in the way she said it, with equal parts warning and despair, told Caleb she had known these men too long, known their cruelty too well, and it wasn't just his life on the line. It was hers, carved into her skin like a brand. And in that moment Caleb swore under his breath that if he had to bleed into the dirt of this cursed ranch to keep her free, then so be it, because $22 may have bought him land, but fate had delivered him something far greater to protect, and he intended to stand tall when the wolves came calling. Dawn broke over the valley in a wash of pale gold, but the light did nothing to ease the weight pressing on Caleb's chest, for the night had been long, filled with the shifting shadows of riders who never came close enough to fire, who lingered just beyond rifle range like phantoms circling a wounded animal. And when the sun rose it only revealed how trapped he was, a man with a crumbling house, a single horse, a girl too weak to run, and a storm of enemies tightening around him. Yet in that bleak stillness Caleb felt a clarity he hadn't known before, a steel settling into his bones, because he realized these men weren't merely after land or revenge. They were after silence, after erasing the living witness who hung in his rafters the night he bought the place, and the thought of them stringing her up again, breaking her spirit until nothing was left, sent a cold fire burning through his veins. So he went outside, boots crunching in the frost-stiff grass, and scanned the horizon, seeing smoke trails far to the west, the kind left by campfires banked low, and he knew they were resting, waiting for night to fall again, and that gave him hours, maybe less, to prepare. But when he turned back toward the cabin he saw her standing in the doorway, blanket draped over her shoulders like some tattered shawl, her dark eyes locked on his with a strength that seemed impossible after what she'd endured, and she whispered one word in broken English: "Run," as if begging him to save himself, to leave her to her fate. But Caleb shook his head, jaw clenched, voice hard and certain. No, not this time. Not for any price, and something in the way he said it drew the faintest spark across her face. Not quite a smile, but not the dead stare she had worn before, a spark that told him maybe, just maybe, she believed he meant it. And so while the sun climbed higher and the hunters lay in their shadows, Caleb set to work, digging shallow trenches by the corral, stacking firewood near the porch where it could burn hot and bright, checking the rifle, the pistol, even the old hatchet left behind in the shed, every action steady and deliberate because he knew the night ahead would be one of fire and blood. And as the girl watched silently from the doorway, the wind carried a sound from the ridges, faint but growing, the bray of a bugle echoing like war drums, and Caleb froze, because that wasn't the call of outlaws. It was the call of men who thought themselves soldiers, and he realized this wasn't a handful of hunters at all. It was something bigger, organized, and worse. The valley itself had been turned into a killing ground, and he and the girl were standing at its center. The smoke from the valley fires still hung low when Caleb pushed open the warped door of the cabin and stepped inside, his boots heavy with mud and his lungs raw from the acrid air. And though exhaustion threatened to drag him under, his mind burned hotter than the embers outside because the bugle he'd heard in the night had changed everything. It wasn't just a pack of marauders prowling his land, but men who carried themselves like they owned the valley, uniforms stripped of insignia, riders who had once been soldiers but were now something darker, mercenaries of the frontier. And the truth clicked into place as surely as the hammer of his rifle. This ranch hadn't been sold to him cheap out of kindness or luck. It had been passed off like poisoned meat, a baited trap for whoever was desperate enough to take it. And that fool had been him, $22 sealing his fate as the next expendable soul to guard a secret buried in these hills. A secret the girl represented, branded into her very skin. For she was no runaway squaw as the whispers in town had claimed, but something far more dangerous to the men who had carved this land into pieces of power. And Caleb realized with a cold weight in his chest that by cutting her down, by choosing to keep her alive, he had inherited a war not just with outlaws but with the very kind of men who thought they could buy silence and bury truth beneath the dirt. And when he looked over at her now, sitting by the hearth with the blanket pulled tight and her eyes tracing his every move, he saw it plain. The fear, yes, but also the knowledge that she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone fool enough to stumble into the snare, and though he wanted to demand answers, to force her to tell him what the mark on her shoulder truly meant, he couldn't, not yet. Because outside he could hear the creak of saddles, the murmur of men preparing for another push, and he knew the time for questions would come only after blood had been spilled, and so he squared his shoulders, checked the rifle once more, and muttered under his breath, $22 bought me a piece of hell, but if they want it back, they'll have to pay a higher price.